None Dare Call It Conspiracy, Chapter 3, The Money Manipulators. Many college history professors tell their charges that the books they will be using in the class are objective. But stop and ask yourself, is it possible to write a history book without a particular point of view? There are billions of events which take place in the world each day. To think of writing a complete history of a nation covering even a year is absolutely incredible. Not only is a historian's ability to write an objective history limited by the sheer volume of happenings, but by the fact that many of the most important happenings never appear in the papers or even in somebody's memoirs. The decisions reached by the big boys in the smoke-filled rooms are not reported even in the New York Times, which ostensibly reports all the news that is fit to print. All the news that fits is a more accurate description. In order to build his case, a historian must select a minuscule number of facts from the limited number that are known. If he does not have a theory, how does he separate important facts from unimportant ones? As Professor Stuart Crane has pointed out, this is why every book proves the author's thesis. But no book is objective. No book can be objective. And this book is not objective. Liberal reviewers should have a ball quoting that out of context. The information in it is true, but the book is not objective. We have carefully selected the facts to prove our case. We believe that most other historians have focused on the landscape and ignored that which is most important: the cart, boy, and donkey. Most of the facts which we bring out are readily verifiable at any large library, but our contention is that we have arranged these facts in the order which most accurately reveals their true significance in history. These are the facts the establishment does not want you to know.
Have you ever had the experience of walking into a mystery movie 2/3 of the way through? Confusing, wasn't it? All the evidence made it look as if the butler were the murderer. But in the final scenes you find out, surprisingly, that it was the man's wife all along. You have to stay and see the beginning of the film. Then, as all the pieces fall into place, the story makes sense. This situation is very similar to the one in which millions of Americans find themselves today. They are confused by current happenings in the nation. They have come in as the movie, so to speak, is going into its conclusion. The earlier portion of the mystery is needed to make the whole thing understandable. Actually, we are not really starting at the beginning, but we are going back far enough to give meaning to today's happenings. In order to understand the conspiracy, it is necessary to have some rudimentary knowledge of banking, and particularly of international bankers. While it would be an oversimplification to ascribe the entire conspiracy to international bankers, they nevertheless have played a key role. Think of the conspiracy as a hand with one finger labeled international banking, others foundations, the anti-religion movement, Fabian socialism, and communism. But it was the international bankers of whom Professor Quigley was speaking when we quoted him earlier as stating that their aim was nothing less than control of the world through finance. Where do governments get the enormous amounts of money they need? Most, of course, comes from taxation. But governments often spend more than they are willing to tax from their citizens and so are forced to borrow. Our national debt is now $455 billion, every cent of it borrowed at interest from somewhere. The public is led to believe that our government borrows from the people through savings bonds. Actually, only the smallest percentage of the national debt is held by individuals in this form. Most government bonds, except those owned by the government itself through its trust funds, are held by vast banking firms known as international banks. For centuries, there has been big money to be made by international bankers in the financing of governments and kings. Such operators are faced, however, with certain thorny problems. We know that smaller banking operations protect themselves by taking collateral. But what kind of collateral can you get from a government or a king? What if the banker comes to collect and the king says, "Off with his head"? The process through which one collects a debt from a government or a monarch is not a subject taught in the business schools of our universities, and most of us, never having been in the business of financing kings, have not given the problem much thought. But there is a king financing business, and to those who can ensure collection it is lucrative indeed. Economics. Professor Stuart Crane notes that there are two means used to collateralize loans to governments and kings. Whenever a business firm borrows big money, its creditor obtains a voice in management to protect his investment. Like a business, no government can borrow big money unless willing to surrender to the creditor some measure of sovereignty as collateral. Certainly, international bankers who have loaned hundreds of billions of dollars to governments around the world command considerable influence in the policies of such governments. But the ultimate advantage the creditor has over the king or president is that if the ruler gets out of line, the banker can finance his enemy or rival. Therefore, if you want to stay in the lucrative king financing business, it is wise to have an enemy or rival waiting in the wings to unseat every king or president to whom you lend. If the king doesn't have an enemy, you must create one. Preeminent in playing this game was the famous House of Rothschild. Its founder, Meyer Amschel Rothschild, 1743 to 1812, of Frankfurt, Germany, kept one of his 5 sons at home to run the Frankfurt Bank, and sent the others to London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples. The Rothschilds became incredibly wealthy during the 19th century by financing governments to fight each other. According to Professor Stuart Crane, if you will look back at every war in Europe during the 19th century, you will see that they always ended with the establishment of a balance of power. With every reshuffling, there was a balance of power in a new grouping around the House of Rothschild in England, France, or Austria. They grouped nations so that if any king got out of line, a war would break out, and the war would be decided by which way the financing went. Researching the debt positions of the warring nations will usually indicate who was to be punished. In describing the characteristics of the Rothschilds and other major international bankers, Dr. Quigley tells us that they remained different from ordinary bankers in several ways. They were cosmopolitan and international. They were close to governments and were particularly concerned with government debts, including foreign government debts. These bankers came to be called international bankers. Quigley, Tragedy and Hope, Peanut 52. One major reason for the historical blackout on the role of the international bankers in political history is that the Rothschilds were Jewish. Anti-Semites have played into the hands of the conspiracy by trying to portray the entire conspiracy as Jewish. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The traditionally Anglo-Saxon J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller international banking institutions have played a key role in the conspiracy. But there is no denying the importance of the Rothschilds and their satellites. However, it is just as unreasonable and immoral to blame all Jews for the crimes of the Rothschilds as it is to hold all Baptists accountable for the crimes of the Rockefellers. The Jewish members of the conspiracy have used an organization called the Anti-Defamation League as an instrument to try to convince everyone that any mention of the Rothschilds or their allies is an attack on all Jews. In this way, they have stifled almost all honest scholarship on international bankers and made the subject taboo within universities. Any individual or book exploring this subject is immediately attacked by hundreds of ADL committees all over the country. The ADL has never let truth or logic interfere with its highly professional smear jobs. When no evidence is apparent, the ADL, which staunchly opposed so-called McCarthyism, accuses people of being latent anti-Semites. Can you imagine how they would yowl and scream if someone accused them of being latent communists? Actually, nobody has a right to be more angry at the Rothschild clique than their fellow Jews. The Warburgs, part of the Rothschild Empire, helped finance Adolf Hitler. There were few, if any, Rothschilds or Warburgs in the Nazi prison camps. They sat out the war in luxurious hotels in Paris or emigrated to the United States or England. As a group, Jews have suffered most at the hands of these power seekers. A Rothschild has much more in common with a Rockefeller than he does with a tailor from Budapest or the Bronx. Since the keystone of the international banking empires has been government bonds, it has been in the interest of these international bankers to encourage government debt. The higher the debt, the more the interest. Nothing drives government deeply into debt like a war, and it has not been an uncommon practice among international bankers to finance both sides of the bloodiest military conflicts. For example, during our Civil War, the North was financed by the Rothschilds through their American agent, August Belmont, and the American South through the Erlangers, Rothschild relatives. But while wars and revolutions have been useful to international bankers in gaining or increasing control over governments, the key to such control has always been control of money. You can control a government if you have it in your debt. A creditor is in a position to demand the privileges of monopoly from the sovereign. Money-seeking governments have granted monopolies in state banking, natural resources, oil concessions, and transportation. However, the monopoly which the international financiers most covet is control over a nation's money. Eventually, these international bankers actually owned as private corporations the central banks of the various European nations. The Bank of England, Bank of France, and Bank of Germany were not owned by their respective governments, as almost everyone imagines, but were privately owned monopolies granted by the heads of state, usually in return for loans. Under this system, observed Reginald McKenna, president of the Midlands Bank of England, those that create and issue the money and credit direct the policies of government and hold in their hands the destiny of the people. Once the government is in debt to the bankers, it is at their mercy. A frightening example was cited by the London Financial Times of September 26, 1921, which revealed that even at that time, half a dozen men at the top of the Big Five banks could upset the whole fabric of government finance by refraining from renewing treasury bills. All those who have sought dictatorial control over modern nations have understood the necessity of a central bank. When the League of Just Men hired a hack revolutionary named Karl Marx to write a blueprint for conquest called the Communist Manifesto, the fifth plank read, "Centralization of credit in the hands of the state, by means of a national bank with a state capital and an exclusive monopoly." Lenin later said that the establishment of a central bank was 90% of communizing a country. Such conspirators knew that you cannot take control of a nation without military force unless that nation has a central bank through which you can control its economy. The anarchist Bakunin sarcastically remarked about the followers of Karl Marx. They have one foot in the bank and one foot in the socialist movement. The international financiers set up their own frontman in charge of each of Europe's central banks. Professor Quigley reports, "It must not be felt that these heads of the world's chief central banks were themselves substantive powers in world finance. They were not. Rather, they were the technicians and agents of the dominant investment bankers of their own countries, who had raised them up and were perfectly capable of throwing them down. The substantive financial powers of the world were in the hands of these investment bankers, also called international or merchants bankers, who remained largely behind the scenes in their own unincorporated private banks. These formed a system of international cooperation and national dominance, which was more private, more powerful, and more secret than that of their agents in the central banks." Quigley, Opus Citatum, Paginas. 3. 26-7 period. Dr. Quigley also reveals that the international bankers who owned and controlled the banks of England and France maintained their power even after those banks were theoretically socialized. Naturally, those who controlled the central banks of Europe were eager from the start to fasten a similar establishment on the United States. From the earliest days, the Founding Fathers had been conscious of attempts to control America through money manipulation, and they carried on a running battle with the international bankers. Thomas Jefferson wrote to John Adams, "I sincerely believe, with you, that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies." But even though America did not have a central bank after President Jackson abolished it in 1836, the European financiers and their American agents managed to obtain a great deal of control over our monetary system. Gustavus Myers, in his History of the Great American Fortunes, reveals, "Under the surface, the Rothschilds long had a powerful influence in dictating American financial laws. The law records show that they were powers in the Old Bank of the United States, abolished by Andrew Jackson. During the 19th century, the leading financiers of the metropolitan East often cut one another's financial throats. But as their western and rural victims started to organize politically, the robber barons saw that they had a community of interest toward which they must work together to protect themselves from thousands of irate farmers and up-and-coming competitors. This diffusion of economic power was one of the main factors stimulating the demands for a central bank by would-be business and financial monopolists. In Years of Plunder, Proctor Hansel writes of this era, "Among the Morgans, Kuhn Loebs, and other similar pillars of the industrial order, there was less disposition to become involved in disagreements that led to financial dislocation. A community of interest came into being, with results that were highly beneficial." But aside from the major Eastern centers, most American bankers and their customers still distrusted the whole concept. In order to show the hinterlands that they were going to need a central banking system, the international bankers created a series of panics as a demonstration of their power, a warning of what would happen unless the rest of the bankers got into line. The man in charge of conducting these lessons was J. Pierpont Morgan, American-born but educated in England and Germany. Morgan is referred to by many, including Congressman Louis McFadden, a banker who for 10 years headed the House Banking and Currency Committee, as the top American agent of the English Rothschilds. By the turn of the century, J.P. Morgan was already an old hand at creating artificial panics. Such affairs were well coordinated. Senator Robert Owen, a co-author of the Federal Reserve Act, who later deeply regretted his role, testified before a congressional committee that the bank he owned received from the National Bankers Association what came to be known as the Panic Circular of 1893. It stated, "You will at once retire 1/3 of your circulation and call in 1/2 of your loans." Historian Frederick Lewis Allen tells in Life magazine of April 25, 1949, of Morgan's role in spreading rumors about the insolvency of the Knickerbocker Bank and the Trust Company of America, which rumors triggered the 1907 panic. In answer to the question, did Morgan precipitate the panic? Allen reports, Oakley Tome, the president of that particular trust company, testified later before a congressional committee that his bank had been subjected to only moderate withdrawals, that he had not applied for help, and that it was the Morgan's Zorpoint statement alone that had caused the run on his bank. From this testimony, plus the disciplinary measures taken by the clearinghouse against the Hainsey, Morse, and Thomas banks, plus other fragments of supposedly pertinent evidence, certain chroniclers have arrived at the ingenious conclusion that the Morgan interests took advantage of the unsettled conditions during the autumn of 1907 to precipitate the panic, guiding it shrewdly as it progressed so that it would kill off rival banks and consolidate the preeminence of the banks within the Morgan orbit. The panic which Morgan had created He proceeded to end almost single-handedly. He had made his point. Frederick Allen explains, "The lesson of the panic of 1907 was clear, though not for some 6 years was it destined to be embodied in legislation. The United States gravely needed a central banking system. The man who was to play the most significant part in providing America with that central bank was Paul Warburg, who along with his brother Felix had immigrated to the United States from Germany in 1902. See Chart 4. They left brother Max, later a major financier of the Russian Revolution, at home in Frankfurt to run the family bank, M.N. Warburg and Company. Paul Warburg married Nina Loeb, daughter of Solomon Loeb of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, America's most powerful international banking firm. Brother Felix married Frieda Schiff, daughter of Jacob Schiff, the ruling power behind Kuhn, Loeb. Stephen Birmingham writes in his authoritative Our Crowd, "In the 18th century, the Schiffs and Rothschilds shared a double house in Frankfurt." Schiff reportedly bought his partnership in Kuhn, Loeb with Rothschild money. Both Paul and Felix Warburg became partners in Kuhn, Loeb and Company. In 1907, the year of the Morgan-precipitated panic, Paul Warburg began spending almost all of his time writing and lecturing on the need for bank reform. Kuhn, Loeb and Company was sufficiently public-spirited about the matter to keep him on salary at $500,000 per year, while for the next 6 years he donated his time to the public good. Working with Warburg in promoting this banking reform was Nelson Aldrich, known as Morgan's floor broker in the Senate. Aldrich's daughter, Abby, married John D. Rockefeller, Jr. The current governor of New York is named for his maternal grandfather.